Okay, let's get started. This is one of those days where you're glad we're doing library events on Zoom. We didn't have to spend the whole day panicking about the weather and the roads and did we want to leave our houses. I'm Susan Claw and I'm a part-time Cornwall resident and I'm on the board of the library. And I helped set up this program and I'm going to introduce Jeremy Brecher, and then we will get started. The library, I wanted to say before we get into his talk, that we have a large collection of Black Lives Matter materials and materials about Martin Luther King for both juveniles and adults. And Margaret, our wonderful librarian, will have those out on display and over the next period of time so that it's easy access. As Jeremy talks, as we always do, you're all muted, but please put questions in the chat and I will read the questions or maybe even call on you to read your own question when the talk is over. Jeremy Brecher has lived in the Yelping Hill community of Cornwall since 1949. During the 1960s, he and his family were active in the Northwestern Connecticut civil rights group Concern. When he proposed to organize support for the Freedom Riders, the principal at Housatonic Regional High School, called the Regional then, forbade him to raise money for the freedom fighters in the school. Maybe this prompted him into a life of political activism, because since then he's written more than a dozen books on labor and social movements and has written or produced more than 20 video documentaries. I've known Jeremy around town since I was a little kid. I remember particularly admiring his treehouse that he lived in for a while and wishing I could live in a treehouse too. And I thought, how cool would it be to be in a treehouse? I think Jeremy spent his summers in the treehouse. But I reconnected with his professional side as an historian when his book Strike was published in 1973. This history of the labor movement in America argued that ordinary people can have power because it's their activity that makes up society and that working together they can affect change. This idea resonated really deeply with the alienated working class youth I was teaching social studies to at the time in an alternative Cambridge high school. And we read and talked about things in Strike frequently. Jeremy's talk today is based on the research he did for a number of TV and radio documentaries on the history of African Americans in Connecticut. I think it's fitting that we know more about this history and use this knowledge to prompt us into activism. As Dr. King said, the time is always right to do what is right. At the library, we're trying to do our small part of what is right, and that is to honor the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King. Thank you for being with us, Jeremy.
So I'm looking at a tiled gallery view of who's here, and I just have to say that it's heartwarming to see so many of my Cornwall neighbors here, and many of my Cornwall neighbors who are not here physically in Cornwall at the moment, but scattered around the country, possibly in some cases around the world, but joining us here. And also many friends who are not Cornwall neighbors, but are people who have been cherished friends who are also spread around the country. And to see us all gathered here together, heartwarming is the only word I can use for it. And I want to thank the library and the people who organized this occasion for pulling it together and making it possible for us to be together this way in spite of weather, distance, and COVID. So look through any biography of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. that was published in the 20th century, and you will find barely a mention of King's experiences in Connecticut. But in 1944, a 15-year-old Martin Luther King spent the summer working on a tobacco farm near Simsbury, Connecticut. His experiences there made a profound and lasting impression on him. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. So how did it happen that a young Atlanta student, Martin Luther King, was picking tobacco in Simsbury, Connecticut? Let's go back to the beginning of the story. Even before European settlement, Native Americans grew tobacco in Connecticut, and it continued to be grown in colonial and statehood times. As a matter of fact, Connecticut was, tobacco was grown at various times in small quantities here in Cornwall. But the tobacco industry in Connecticut took off around 1900 with what was known as shade-grown or Sumatra tobacco. And some of you, I'm sure many of you once or twice have seen farms laid out around Connecticut, eastern Connecticut, east of the river, with huge white sheets of gauze staked out over the fields. And that was an effort to simulate the conditions that existed in Sumatra and other jungle areas to grow what was known as shade-grown tobacco. And it became a tremendously successful and tremendously profitable industry in Connecticut because the soils on the east side of the Connecticut River were also ideal, like the soils in Sumatra, for growing the shade-grown tobacco, which was used as wrapper for cigars. So by the lead into World War I, around 1915, there developed a labor shortage in the tobacco fields in Connecticut. Some of the Eastern European workers went back home to their home countries because they knew the war was coming and they wanted to get back home before the war. The factories in Hartford started gearing up for war production, and the everyone who could stopped working in the tobacco fields and went to the factories where the wages were much better and the conditions much better. And so the tobacco farms were left with a severe labor shortage. And as they discussed it and tried to figure out what to do about it, they decided to try hiring Black workers from the South. As a matter of fact, many of the farmers in the tobacco industry in Connecticut had been plantation managers in the South. And they're sometimes quoted as saying, oh, we're fine with that. We're familiar with Black labor. We're used to working with Black labor. Let's do it. But they had a problem. They actually sent buses to New York City and tried hiring people off the street. And they found out this was not a good way to recruit a labor force. And so they decided, let's go to the Urban League, which was a fairly new organization devoted to helping migrants from the South who were trying to establish themselves in northern cities. They said, well, why not in the northern farm country also? And they went to the Urban League and they said, we understand why you would be suspicious of what we're up to here, but we're not trying to find a labor force with cheap labor. We want to do it right. That's why we came to you. And they made an agreement with the Urban League for standard labor conditions, wages, and supervision by the Urban League, inspection of the camps. And the Urban League arranged for students from what we now refer to as traditionally Black colleges of the South to come to Simsbury and elsewhere in the tobacco fields and work. And to give you some sense of the scale of this, there were 1,400 students from Virginia, North Carolina, Florida, and Georgia who came to work in the tobacco fields in Connecticut during World War II. And it had a bigger impact than that because when the Black students came, often supervised, by the way, by their professors and staff people from their own colleges, they went back and said to people, hey, you might want to try checking out this Connecticut scene. And there were 1,500 Blacks in Hartford in 1916, and there were 4,000 a year later. So what was known as the Great Migration had its beginning with the students who came up to work in the tobacco fields. This, of course, declined during the years of the Great Depression, but again, labor shortage hit the tobacco fields in World War II. And again, under supervision of the Urban League, Black students began coming up in organized groups to work in summer jobs in the tobacco fields. There were over 100 from Morehouse who came and that was the group that a young Martin Luther King came from. 100 came to one farm in Simsbury, primarily to earn college expenses. So now we get to Martin Luther King and what this experience was for him. It was King's first exposure to racial attitudes outside the segregated South, and he was astonished by what he saw. He wrote a series of letters home, which were unknown until they were finally published in 1992 in the papers of Martin Luther King Jr. And up to that time, there was an occasional mention of the fact that astonishingly, Martin Luther King had worked in the tobacco fields in Connecticut, but there was virtually nothing that was known about it, certainly nothing that was being published about it. But King wrote a series of letters home, which are now very available historical documents. He wrote his father, "Dear Father, on our way here, we saw some things I had never anticipated to see. After we passed Washington, there was no discrimination at all. The white people here are very nice. We go to any place we want to and sit anywhere we want to." Then a little bit later, he wrote his mother, "Dear Mother, yesterday we didn't work, so we went to Hartford. We really had a nice time there. I never thought that a person of my race could eat anywhere, but we ate in one of the finest restaurants in Hartford, and we went to one of the largest shows there." King sang in a boys' choir. He joined a boys' choir in the tobacco region and sang with them, and the choir appeared on a local radio program. If it had been TV, maybe there would have been more problem, but the fact that it was on radio, what did it matter that one of the singers was Black? He also led religious meetings that were held on Sunday nights in the dorm, in the barracks, which were kind of like World War II soldiers' barracks, pretty much modeled on that. Bernice Martin, who was widow of the choir director at the First Church of Christ at Simsbury, recalled having the Black students in the church was also an education for the white parishioners. That was the only time that we'd had any colored people in the church. William Pickens was one of the Black students who came up from Morehouse. He later became a professor at Morehouse, and he came north from Atlanta and became a friend of Martin Luther King's at the camp. Somebody tracked him down. In fact, we tracked him down for the documentary that we did for Connecticut Public Television, and interviewed him. And he said, it was just an unfamiliar situation that one could chat with a white person who was a peer. There were workers just like we were, and we could talk with them briefly during lunchtime and not get taken to jail for it. I do believe that the experience probably did have an influence on Martin's ability to decide in favor of the ministry, because he could see a society that was vastly different from the one in which she had been born, one that was hospitable to African-American males in a way that was new. Pickens said, in Connecticut, we felt freer than we had ever felt in our lives. By the way, the Coleman Brothers tobacco farm, where King and Pickens worked, has recently been listed on the National Register of Historic Places and purchased for historic preservation. Now, the next section of my talk is titled The Connecticut Backstory, What King Couldn't Know. While the youthful Martin Luther King could observe the blatant differences between race relations in Connecticut and the South, he had no way of knowing less visible aspects of race relations in Connecticut or their history. The Connecticut colony practiced race-based slavery from its inception. The Massachusetts colonists sent an expeditionary force into Connecticut before the colony was actually established, the Connecticut colony, and conducted a massacre on the Pequot Indians, who controlled the gateway, the entryway to Connecticut in the northeast part of this, what became the Connecticut colony, and then the state. And they went in and slaughtered men, women, and children. There are indications in their statements that their purpose was in fact genocide, to wipe out the entire tribe. And then the people that they didn't kill, they enslaved. And so you had Native American slaves from the time that the first colonists of European descent came into Connecticut. But they had a problem, which is that the Pequot knew the territory a heck of a lot better than the Massachusetts English settlers did. And they were constantly slipping away, going out into the swamps, and it was practically impossible to effectively enslave them. So the Connecticut colonists took a group of captured Pequot and took them to the Caribbean and exchanged them to be enslaved there. They exchanged them for slaves of African origin and brought them back to Connecticut and used them as slave labor in Connecticut, again, from the very earliest times of the colony. By the way, the principal slave owners in Connecticut from then on through to the abolition of slavery were the congregational ministers, who were usually the wealthiest people in the town, and they needed somebody to do the work on their farms while they were preaching. I will now go fast forward here. Connecticut in the early 19th century engaged in what was called gradual emancipation. And as a matter of fact, it was very gradual. The last person enslaved in Connecticut remained a slave until she died in 1848. Connecticut was also the only New England state after the abolition of slavery that did not allow Blacks to vote. There's a series of Black proto-civil rights organizations that I'm just going to mention. One of the first was the Connecticut Equal Rights League, which was predominantly predominantly Black with white allies. It was formed to demand the right to vote in Connecticut for African Americans, which was refused then and continued to be refused until the 15th Amendment to the federal Constitution required the enfranchisement of Blacks. However, as that was happening, there was also a major migration from rural to urban areas on the part of Connecticut's Black population. Blacks became overwhelmingly concentrated in the major cities, and they were effectively disenfranchised by Connecticut's rotten borough system, which some of you I know will remember, which was a system that gave every town 2 votes in the state legislature, whether like the town of Cornwall, they had 1,000 or 1,500 residents, or like the cities of Hartford or New Haven, they had 100 or 150,000 residents. And so the vote of a Black voter in Hartford or New Haven was worth a tiny percentage of what the vote was of a citizen of Cornwall. So the struggles for greater equality for Blacks continued in the 1890s. Blacks and allies formed something called the Sumner League, named after Charles Sumner, who had been a great figure of abolitionism in the slavery period. And they submitted legislation to outlaw discrimination in public places in Connecticut. However, the Hartford hotel owners decided that they didn't want that. And so they organized and mobilized and defeated the attempt to have a public accommodations law guaranteeing the right to public access for all to public accommodations. The economic exclusion in Connecticut was, if anything, more extreme. Studied by the Hartford Urban League in 1921, found there were 900 employed Black workers in the Hartford area. Most were on the lowest rung of the economy, servants and porters. 110 of them were domestic workers. The biggest industries in Connecticut were insurance and industrial production factories. There was 1 Black worker in insurance and 11 in factories. Meanwhile, white immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe had been pouring into Connecticut, and they were filling the factories while Black workers were excluded. And the resistance also applied in unions, which in many cases refused to allow Black workers to join the union, and then made union control of hiring be the basis for excluding them from working in skilled labor jobs. Housing, a study in Waterbury in 1920 found that 90% of Blacks were concentrated in one neighborhood. And similar findings could have been made, in some cases were made, for the other major Connecticut cities. And at the level of, let's say, ideology, or to use a more dignified term, theory, Connecticut, and specifically Yale University, was a, I was going to say hotbed, but let's say font of what was known as scientific racism. The Sheffield School, which was a major scientific institution at Yale, its president was one of the leading proponents of scientific racism, which made a hierarchy of racial, of the capabilities and natural abilities of different racial groups. And by sheer coincidence, the whites, who were the major European, whites of European origin, who happened to be the people who were the professors at the Sheffield School, were at the top of this hierarchy. And the, as they would have said in polite terms, they're Negroes, the Negro race, which happened to be very much involved in cooking and cleaning and other service occupations at Yale, happened to be at the bottom of that hierarchy. The resistance, organized resistance in Connecticut continued. The first chapter of the National Association of Colored People, NAACP, was formed in Hartford on the initiative of a remarkable woman named Mary Seymour Townsend, who also organized a union of women tobacco workers in the area where Martin Luther King, a decade later, was going to be, or actually closer to 2 decades later, was going to be picking tobacco. However, there was another side to Connecticut, counterposed to the civil rights movements over the decades that I've described. Connecticut was also a major national center of the second Ku Klux Klan. And as a matter of fact, in the mid-1920s, there were 23 chapters of the Ku Klux Klan in Connecticut with 18,000 members. So these are all things to keep in mind when we think about what Martin Luther King observed in his time in Connecticut. He could observe racial integration in such areas as public accommodations and churches. But Connecticut's more subtle forms of segregation and discrimination were less visible. These were documented almost simultaneously with King's visit by Connecticut's fledgling interracial commission, which was actually the first official state civil rights agency in the United States. It conducted a series of studies in 1943, 44, 45, and found some things that Martin King was really not in a position to observe. So for example, in 1940, there were only 16 Negro stenographers, typists, and secretaries employed in the entire state. And this is a state that had a huge white collar, predominantly in the insurance industry, but also in various other white collar industries. There were no Negro sales clerks in major department stores in 1943. In 1943, there were no Negroes in any school of nursing in Connecticut except at Yale University. The commission surveyed the 9 municipalities where most Connecticut Blacks lived. They found, of these 9 places, only Bridgeport has Negro firemen, only Hartford has Negro librarians, only 3 cities have Negro teachers. Did you get that? Only 3 cities in Connecticut where the major Black population was centered had Black teachers. And only 4 places have Negroes in administrative or clerical positions within municipal government. The commission also found that much of the residential property in the state was covered by restrictive covenants, under which owners agreed not to sell to Negroes or other specified racial, ethnic, and religious groups. I'm sure many of you have seen or heard about the movie Gentleman's Agreement, which is actually set in Connecticut, and it's actually about restrictive covenants designed to prevent purchase of property by Jews. So if you imagine that these restrictive covenants were even more ubiquitous against Blacks, you would not be barking up the wrong tree. It's also little known today that other groups were definitely included. For example, around some of the lakes in Connecticut, the restrictive covenants included Poles, and then no Poles were allowed to buy land around prestigious lake residential settlements. So, and one more fact here that I didn't know, I just learned it while I was doing the research for this talk. In 1944 at Bradley Field, which we know as, I think, Bradley International airport, it's got an even new, more fancier, more impressive name. But in some of our days, it was known as Bradley Field, 50 miles away from the farm where Martin Luther King was working. Segregation was so strictly enforced in 1944 that Black servicemen were forced to eat in separate canteens and use separate facilities. So, fast forward, what about Connecticut today? So, let's start with wages. In the United States as a whole, a Black worker makes about 83 cents for every dollar that a median worker, that is including both Black and white workers, makes. And that's in my opinion, shocking and outrageous fact, 83 cents compared to $1. However, a typical Connecticut Black worker makes 68 cents for every dollar that the median Connecticut worker earns. A 2020 study of the Hartford metropolitan region called, I love this title, A Steady Habit of Segregation. Most of you are familiar with Connecticut being called the land of steady habits. So A Steady Habit of Segregation by Brandeis University professor Susan Eaton found, by all available measures, both the state of Connecticut and the Hartford metropolitan area have extremely high levels of racial and ethnic segregation in housing and public schools relative to other metropolitan areas in the United States. In Connecticut, more than 2/3 of people of color live in only 15 of the state's 169 cities and towns. Contemporary evidence related to zoning, housing, and lending indicates ongoing discrimination and disparate harms to Black and Latinx residents of Connecticut. And apparently this is not an accident, according to the study. Continuing exclusionary zoning in suburbia, coupled with state government housing-related policies and program practices, reinforces segregation. State government's active rejection of regionalism in housing and schools cemented segregation in place and operationalized political power of white suburbia. The evidence here indicates that in housing, and particularly in the area of school desegregation, it was lawmakers' deference to white suburbia through unabashed allegiance to local control that fatally circumscribed state practice and policy over the decades. So let's get back to Martin Luther King. A few years after his sojourn in the tobacco fields, Martin Luther King Jr. recalled his return from Connecticut to the segregated South. It was a bitter feeling going back to segregation. It was hard to understand why I could ride wherever I pleased on the train from New York to Washington, and then had to change to a Jim Crow car at the nation's capital in order to continue the trip to Atlanta. King's experiences in the North stayed with him. He later referred to his experience in Connecticut in 1944 as formative. I felt an inescapable urge to serve society, a sense of responsibility, which I could not escape. In the years following the Montgomery bus boycott, Dr. King returned to Connecticut to lecture and preach. In a speech at Yale's Batelic Chapel, King proclaimed, "Negroes and whites must learn to live together as brothers, or they will perish together as fools." He also said, "We stand at the border of the promised land of integration." Looking at the realities of Connecticut today, many decades later, we must ask, have we yet crossed that border into that promised land?
Thank you, Jeremy. That's great. Let's see if we have some questions here. So people, take a minute, put your questions in the chat. Jeremy, my question listening was, I mean, I had many, but one, I was struck with what you said about the Klan, that Connecticut was like the second biggest, what did you say, the second biggest?
It's one of the six largest centers of the Klan.
Now, how did that come about, you know?
Well, first of all, let me say that there's a superb book on the Second Klan that if anyone's interested, I recommend. And I will dredge up the author and title from my failing memory shortly. But the Second Klan was to a great extent directed against Jews and Catholics. It was not particularly friendly to African Americans, but it was really the cultural threat and more broadly job and political threat presented by European immigrants, both Catholic and Jewish, that really rallied the Second Klan. And that was a very large population in Connecticut. It had a huge influx of Eastern European immigrants down in the period leading up to World War I, and a substantial number of them were Jews, and the continuing Jewish immigration thereafter. And that was the rallying target for the Second Klan, and especially in Connecticut. And it had a strong Christian, a nativist Christian, anti-Jewish, anti-Catholic drive to it. And it was quite substantial. For example, there's a newspaper clipping showing from the, I believe, mid-1920s with reporting on a induction of new members on a hillside overlooking New Haven, with induction of 300 new members. Is a nighttime outdoor event, inducting 300 new members with an audience of about 5,000. So that's the scale outside New Haven. So that's the scale that it went on. And it was a little different from the first Klan in the sense that it wasn't well known for lynchings. It was a huge events, public events like this one, and it used them as a recruiting tool. It did a lot of selling of merchandise. It was supported by a lot of ministers, so it was more of a public gala type rather than night riding and lynchings as his modus operandi. But it was still, we would not say, in accord with what would hope would be regarded a different version of Americanism that was a little more friendly to different kinds of people. And and my dear friend Dolores Hayden has put in the chat, Linda Gordon is the author of the book. And can somebody remember the title and put it in the chat?
Thank you for that. I had no idea. I didn't know anything about the second Klan. This sounds like a stupid question, but did the second Klan wear the white robes and things over their heads?
Yes, and they were very and very into ritual and a lot of play acting, I think. And the book is called The Second Coming of the KKK by Linda Gordon. And thank you, Dolores. It's great to see you here.
Anyone else with questions?
And here is the book. And thank you to my sister-in-law, Virginia.
We have 106 people here, so I can't see you if you're raising your hand. So if you could put a question in the chat, that would be great if people have questions. My other question, as you were talking, Jeremy, was did white students come to pick in the summer to the tobacco? Was it like for raising funds, or was this something just Black students did from the Black colleges?
The original workforce, as far as I know, going back to the beginning of the industry, was primarily a local workforce initially, and very much included local students who would have been entirely or almost entirely white, who worked in the tobacco fields and barns in the original period as family members or neighbors, and they were a major part of the workforce in the summer, which was when the work needed to get done. And that remained the case until World War I comes. I believe they continued to be working, at least some of them. If they were old enough, they could go to Hartford and get a factory job and make substantially more money. But I believe in general, they continued being part of it. There was definitely not an influx from the South of white workers coming to work in the tobacco fields. There may have been some who just came because they heard that there was, better jobs in the North. And I mean, certainly there was massive white migration, both at the same time to northern cities. The white workers generally could have access to the factory jobs, which were much better paying and generally better conditions. And so in general, if white workers were coming up from the South, both during World War I and during World War II, they would be much more likely to go to the major cities and work in the factories.
We have a couple more questions here about the Klan. Jane Duber wanted to know, where's the second Klan now?
The second Klan, you'll find a fascinating account of its demise in Linda Gordon's book. And it became progressively visibly corrupt. More and more of the leaders were prosecuted for embezzlement, essentially. And it also became less and less respectable. The idea of this kind of racism became something that was kind of frowned on in growing circles, not obviously by everyone, but it became more subject to criticism and to being regarded as not really okay. And the person who was it was started largely as a financial operation. It was an attempt to make money, kind of like the Scopes trial. If you know the real backstory of the Scopes trial, which was also cooked up as a kind of promotional deal to make some money out of the publicity. So, and the person who became the most visible national leader of the Klan eventually was prosecuted for a number of crimes, which included not only financial crimes, but also murder and overtones of cannibalism. And this kind of undermined their credibility to some extent.
Someone is asking Maisa Tisdale, I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing your name wrong, Maisa, wasn't the KKK headquartered in Shelton, Connecticut under David Duke in the 1980s? There was a resurgence.
First of all, let me say hello to my dear friend, Maisa Tisdale, who, although not a Cornwall resident, has visited me here a number of times, who is the founder and moving spirit of a wonderful Black history preservation and education program in Bridgeport. And Maisa, if you can put your website and any other information in the chat, I'm sure there will be people who will be interested in following up on it. And the answer is yes, there have been KKK revivals repeatedly, and there was indeed a center of activity in Shelton, Connecticut, also in which is in the Naugatuck Valley, south of Waterbury, and also in Scotland, Connecticut, where there actually were fairly substantial KKK public rallies that were held. So it definitely was the case. I would say it never in that period became anything of a mass movement. I think there were scores of people who were active, perhaps 100, 200 who were identified with it and publicly associated with it, but these were not mass movements in the same way that previous Klan things were, but it certainly helped lay the groundwork for some of the more outrageous things that are regarded as acceptable in a lot of quarters today.
Peter Demi wanted to know, could you talk about reparation as a method to rectify past economic and social injustices?
It's not something that I'm an expert on, but I was for a long time pretty much a skeptic about it, mostly because I couldn't see how you would identify the people to whom you would give reparations. And, is there one person whose 17 great-great-great-great-grandfather or grandmother were enslaved by somebody who you can find whose great-great-great-great-great-grandmother or grandfather enslaved them, and then would you figure out the value of the labor and apply it to the make one of them pay reparations to the other one. And I just couldn't see how it would work. But actually, that was a lack of my own imagination and intelligence in understanding how it could work. And in fact, there now are cities which are actually have reparations programs and done in a way that I thought was absolutely brilliant, which was not to try to deal with it as an individual matter where you're compensating someone for a wrong that was done to some person that they were descended from, but rather identifying the overall harm that was done to African-American people, and then looking at the aspects of today's society that still are resulting from that. So instead of trying to compensate for a wrong that was done 100 years ago, you say what we first of all have to compensate for is the wrong that is still being done today. The wage gap that I talked about would perhaps be an example of that. The educational exclusion would perhaps be an example of that. And then say, this is a harm that for which compensation, for which a remedy can be forged. And the remedy is not to give individuals cash grants, but to have extra programs in the schools, for example, that provide compensatory assistance for African-American students, and numerous other very thoughtful, very intelligent approaches to how do you make a remedy for this kind of harm. So I have completely changed my views on it and come to see that as an entirely appropriate thing to do.
I have to say I have too. Phyllis Knox said, I'm stunned by the discrepancy in Connecticut between Black and white wages. Why is Connecticut so much worse?
I can't actually tell you because I just discovered that as I was doing the research for this talk. And so I haven't had a chance. I very much had the same question and want to go back. I can tell you that deindustrialization basically had a terrible hit on the Connecticut Black workforce, also on the white workforce, but industrial labor, by the time you're getting into the post-World War II era, Blacks were in the factories and it was a major source of employment. And as the Connecticut factories closed down, it hit Black workers even harder than white workers. I think you'll also find, but I don't have documentation for this, that in the major white collar employments, such as what's left of the insurance industry, real estate, finance, which is, so FIRE, as it's sometimes called, the big white collar employment areas are still very, very large in Connecticut. And they are still not particularly hospitable to African Americans. So those would be at least two of the reasons. I'm sure there are others. Actually, and this was referred to in the study that I was mentioning. Another has to do with the extreme separation between the towns. So employment, which was primarily concentrated in cities, is now overwhelmingly in suburban areas in Connecticut. And there is concentration of Blacks and de facto exclusion in the suburban areas and concentration in the urban areas. And the jobs are predominantly in the suburban areas. And that makes a major deterrent to African Americans being able to get jobs, and especially higher quality jobs, and relegates them to low wage, low quality jobs. And this is greatly exacerbated by the Connecticut transportation system. because it's so difficult. There's a lack of public transit, makes it impossible for people in the urban areas to get jobs in the suburban areas. And I could go on. I think the housing discrimination is a major part of this. Again, people can't live near where the jobs are. And then there's just discrimination as discrimination, not hiring people because they're different or because they're prejudiced against them. And I find it hard to believe that that does not continue to exist in Connecticut.
Jeremy, Roxana Robinson said, I'm curious about your comments about congregational ministers being the most affluent and biggest slave owners in Connecticut communities. From my limited knowledge of Cornwall, that wasn't the case. Was that an anomaly? Many towns could barely pay their ministers and they got paid in firewood and poultry.
So first, let me say that this is not a field in which I'm an expert. I'm not a colonial historian. I do know that it was frequently said at the time of the Great Schism in the Cornwall Church that the underlying motive, and this is somewhat articulated in some of the documentary evidence, but I can't prove it, that there was a dispute over how much Reverend Gold, the minister, should be paid. And many of the Cornwall farmers didn't want to pay that much to the richest man in town. So at that point, and this could be checked, perhaps probate records if someone really wanted to research it. But I think, and I can't give you a reference right off, but I think it's pretty prominent in the literature on early Connecticut. And certainly in the 20th century, it would be a different story. But if you're talking about 18th, early 19th century, the ministers were, generally speaking, the leading men in the Cornwall, in the Connecticut communities, and generally were the what was known as the standing order, the wealthiest and most powerful segment of the community. Now, Roxana, you may well be right, and I may well be wrong, and I would love to be corrected, but that's the picture as I understand it. And maybe I should stop there because my ignorance has just reached its point of manifestation.
Tom Zetterstrom has his hand raised, so go ahead. You have to unmute yourself, or maybe I have to unmute you. Let me see. Now I think you should be able to unmute yourself.
Yeah, Jeremy, are you reading me?
Yeah. And let me just say, Tom is a friend of mine from high school, and many, many points in between. Go ahead, Tom.
Can you bring a reflection on racism to the present moment with, the manipulations by Donald Trump and contrast those with Connecticut's embrace of Obama?
I think the election of Barack Obama as president of the United States is one of the most remarkable phenomena in American history. As you say, Connecticut strongly supported Obama in both elections. And I think that the fact that he was elected nationally is illustrative of the fact that racial attitudes are malleable that under the right circumstances, they can be substantially modified. What gets expressed and what doesn't get expressed can be very different, and we need to approach it historically. The fact that Connecticut, or in spite of the long history of racism that I described, also has a very, very long history of resistance to racism, of efforts both rooted in Black communities, but also rooted in white allies, shows the fact that we are not dealing with immutable phenomena that are just the way things are, and that it's not subject to change and not worth fighting against, to make the important point here. But we can also see from this history that I recounted that there is a tendency of the racist attitudes to be very deeply embedded in American society, including in Connecticut, and to come roaring back in situations where there isn't a continuous struggle against them. And I think that that's something that obviously we've seen a lot of lately, and unfortunately we're seeing a lot of today.
I think on that we should end. I'd like to thank Jeremy very much. We had an amazing audience. I think we all learned a lot of stuff that we didn't know, and hopefully we will. I think that the Historical Society this summer is working on an exhibit which is going to deal with issues of enslaved people in Cornwall or in the area. So touching on some of these subjects. So, maybe we'll be able to continue this conversation this summer for those of you who are in Cornwall. Okay, so goodbye, everyone. Thank you for coming. Remember, the library always welcomes your donations. And we will see you at our next program. I hope you're all on our mailing list.
Thank you so much.